Please, sir, bless me with some money. God will bless you more. Your family will never lack. I pray for your job, your life. You will never lack anything, Joe repeated. His voice weary but intentional, a mix of desperation and strategy. A man in a dark suit slowed his pace, glanced at Joe and sighed. Here, take this. Make sure you get something to eat, he said, dropping a crumpled note into Joe's trembling hands. The man hurried off before Joe could respond. God bless you, sir. God bless your family, Joe called after him, his lips curving into a small, fleeting smirk. Oak Bridge, the busiest spot in town, was alive with noise and movement. The air was thick with the scent of roasted corn, fried snacks, and exhaust fumes. Street vendors shouted to advertise their goods. Vehicles honked impatiently, and people moved with purpose, their faces etched with the day's worries. Joe sat cross-legged on a worn mat, his appearance carefully crafted to elicit sympathy. His patched shirt hung loosely over his thin frame, and his face was smeared with just enough grime to appear pitiful but not alarming. He shook a small tin cup, the clinking coins inside drawing the attention of passers-by. A woman with a baby strapped to her back slowed down, her eyes lingering on Joe. God will help you, she whispered, dropping a few coins. Joe looked up, his eyes wide and grateful. Thank you, Ma. God will reward you, he said earnestly, though the sincerity in his voice was practiced. By noon, Joe's pouch was significantly heavier. He picked it up, glanced around cautiously, and walked toward a quieter part of the bridge, leaning against a cracked pillar. He opened the pouch and began counting his earnings. His lips moved silently as he calculated. Not bad for today, he muttered, a sly smile spreading across his face. He tied the pouch tightly, slipped it into his bag, and headed to an uncompleted building a few streets away. The building stood in stark contrast to the bustling bridge. Its walls were bare, and the floor was littered with broken blocks and empty sachets of water. Joe moved quickly, shedding his ragged shirt and replacing it with a clean, neatly pressed one. He swapped his torn trousers for a pair of faded jeans that fit just right. Catching his reflection in a cracked mirror propped against the wall, he straightened his collar and smoothed his hair. Perfect, he said, flashing a self-assured grin. He adjusted the strap of his leather bag and walked out, his posture now confident, his demeanor that of someone entirely different. As he stepped into the street, Joe's phone buzzed. He pulled it out and checked the screen. It was a message from someone named Kenny. Kenny, we need to talk. Same spot, 6 p.m. Don't be late. Joe's smile faded, replaced by a frown. He shoved the phone back into his pocket and quickened his pace. The same spot meant the abandoned warehouse near the old train station, a place that held more secrets than most could imagine. Joe's double life demanded careful planning, and meetings like these were both necessary and dangerous. At exactly 6 p.m., Joe arrived at the warehouse. The air inside was musty, and faint beams of light streamed through broken windows. Kenny was already there, leaning against a stack of wooden crates. He was tall, with a scar running from his left eyebrow to his cheek, giving him a permanent look of menace. "You're late," Kenny growled, though his tone suggested he had expected nothing less. "I'm here, aren't I?" Joe shot back, trying to sound unbothered. Kenny's eyes narrowed. "How's business?" Joe shrugged. "Steady. The bridge is good. People are generous." Kenny's lips twisted into a mocking smile. "Generous. Or gullible?" Joe chuckled softly. "Does it matter? Money's money." Kenny stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You know the rules, Joe. You don't keep everything for yourself." Joe's jaw tightened. "I know the rules. You'll get your share." "Good," Kenny said, his gaze lingering on Joe for a moment before he stepped back. "Because if you forget—" "I won't," Joe interrupted, his voice firm. He held Kenny's gaze, refusing to show any sign of fear. Kenny smirked. "Smart man. See you next week." As Joe left the warehouse, He felt the familiar mix of relief and unease. Kenny was not a man to cross, and Joe knew he was walking a thin line. But for now he had survived another day. Walking back toward the bridge, Joe's mind raced. He needed a way out, a plan to leave this life behind. But for now the game continued, and Joe knew how to play it well. Saturday nights always led Joe to a secluded part of town. The moon cast an eerie glow over the narrow, uneven path that wound through overgrown bushes. At the end of the path stood a small, decrepit hut, its thatched roof sagging under the weight of years. Faint wisps of smoke curled up from the chimney, carrying the pungent scent of burnt herbs and incense. Joe hesitated for a moment, adjusting the strap of his bag before pushing open the creaking wooden door. Inside, the air was thick and heavy. Shelves lined with jars of powders, roots, and bones crowded the dimly lit space. A single lantern cast flickering shadows on the walls, making the room feel alive. The herbalist sat cross-legged on a mat, his bony frame wrapped in a faded red cloth. His eyes, sharp and unsettling, met Joe's. "You're early today," the herbalist said, his gravelly voice breaking the silence. Joe stepped forward and dropped a bundle of money on the wooden table in front of the old man. "Count it. Double it. I've done my part." The herbalist's lips curled into a knowing smile as he scooped up the money with his wrinkled hands. "Impatient as always," he muttered, spreading the bills out carefully. He reached for a small clay pot and began sprinkling a shimmering powder over the money. His chants, low and rhythmic, filled the room, the words incomprehensible but charged with an unsettling energy. Joe watched intently, his hands clenched at his sides. The chanting grew louder, the air in the room seeming to pulse with each word. Finally, the herbalist stopped and handed the bundle back to Joe. The stack of money now appeared thicker, almost impossibly so. The old man's eyes gleamed as he leaned closer. "Remember," he said, his tone dark and foreboding, "for every coin you take, their luck becomes yours. But if you're caught..." Joe's jaw tightened. "I won't be caught." The herbalist's smile faded. "You've said that before. Be careful, boy. The spirits don't like arrogance." Joe said nothing, tucking the money into his bag. As he turned to leave, the herbalist called out, "One more thing. The balance must always be kept. If you take too much..." Joe paused, his back to the old man. "I know the rules," he said flatly, stepping out into the night. The cool air hit him like a splash of water, clearing his head. He walked quickly, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The bag felt heavier than before, the weight of the money and the ritual pressing on his mind. As he reached the main road, his phone buzzed. Joe pulled it out and read the message on the screen. "Unknown number. You're playing a dangerous game. Watch your back." Joe's heart skipped a beat. He looked around, the shadows suddenly feeling darker and more alive. He stuffed the phone back into his pocket and quickened his pace, his mind racing. Back at his apartment, Joe locked the door and leaned against it, exhaling deeply. He placed the bag on the table and stared at it. The money was there, but so were the risks, the warnings, and the unknown sender of the message. As the clock ticked toward midnight, Joe's unease grew. The herbalist's words echoed in his mind. The balance must always be kept. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the thought, but a chill ran down his spine. Somewhere in the distance, a dog howled, its mournful cry piercing the silence. Joe turned off the light and sat in the darkness, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. He was in too deep now, and the game he played was far from over. Sunday afternoons brought a quiet calm to Oak Bridge, but this particular day would be anything but calm. Minister Abel, a man known for his unwavering faith and discerning spirit, walked across the bustling bridge. His kind eyes scanned the area, taking in the familiar sight of vendors and beggars. His gaze settled on Joe, hunched over and murmuring his practiced pleas. Abel paused, his spirit stirred. He reached into his pocket and handed Joe a crisp bill. Joe muttered a faint "God bless you," his voice flat. As Abel walked away, an unsettling chill gripped him. He stopped abruptly, a strange nudge pressing on his heart. Turning back, he approached Joe once more. "Young man, may I pray for you?" he asked gently. Joe's eyes widened in surprise. "Pray? No need for that, sir. Just leave the money and go," he said, his tone dismissive. But Abel's determination was unwavering. "God is telling me there's more to your story. Please let me pray for you." Joe's heart began to race. His hands trembled slightly as he clutched the pouch by his side. "I said no," he snapped, his voice laced with a hint of panic. "Just go." Abel stepped closer, his voice calm but firm. "Sometimes when God speaks, we must listen. I'm not here to judge you." Before Joe could protest further, Abel placed a hand on his shoulder and began to pray. The words rolled out with power and conviction, each syllable cutting through the noise of the bustling bridge. Joe flinched, his body reacting as if the words burned. His knees buckled and he collapsed to the ground, shaking violently. "Stop! Stop it!" he screamed, his voice filled with desperation. Onlookers began to gather, their murmurs growing louder. Abel continued, his prayers unwavering. Joe's cries turned to uncontrollable sobs. "I'm sorry. Forgive me," Joe wailed, his voice echoing across the bridge. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the hardened beggar crumbled before the minister. Abel knelt beside Joe, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. "Speak, son. What is troubling you?" he asked softly. Joe's chest heaved as he struggled to compose himself. Through tears, he began to confess. "I'm not mad. I've been pretending. Pretending to beg. Every coin I collect, it's cursed. I take it to a herbalist who uses it to steal people's fortunes. That's how I survive." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Whispers of shock and disbelief spread like wildfire. "Cursed money," someone murmured. "Stealing fortunes." Abel's focus never wavered. "Why, Joe? Why would you do this?" he asked, his voice filled with compassion. Joe's voice cracked as he spoke. "I lost my parents when I was young. My relatives treated me like trash. I ran away and joined some boys on the streets. They taught me this evil trade. I didn't want to do it, but I had no choice. It was either this or starve." Tears welled up in Abel's eyes as he listened. "There is always a choice, son. You can choose a different path. But first, you must show me this herbalist." Joe hesitated, his eyes darting nervously. "He's dangerous. If he finds out I brought you, God will protect us," Abel said firmly. "You've taken the first step by confessing. Now let's finish this together." Joe nodded slowly, his fear mingled with a flicker of hope. "Okay, I'll take you to him. But we have to be careful." Abel stood, helping Joe to his feet. The crowd parted as they walked away, whispers following them. Joe's heart pounded with every step, but for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of something he thought he'd lost forever: redemption. Joe led Abel down a narrow, winding path that cut through the dense woods. The air was thick with tension, every rustle of leaves making Joe flinch. His hands trembled as he clutched his pouch, and his breaths were shallow. "It's not far now," Joe muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Abel walked beside him, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Joe's anxiety. "Fear not, Joe. Whatever we find, God is with us." The journey felt like an eternity, but at last, they reached the small, decrepit hut. The moonlight revealed its sagging roof and weathered walls. Joe hesitated, his feet rooted to the ground. "What if he's inside?" Joe asked, his voice quivering. Abel placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We'll face it together." With a deep breath, Joe pushed the door open. The creak echoed in the stillness of the night. Inside, the hut was in chaos. Ashes and burnt herbs covered the floor, and shelves lay overturned, their contents scattered. The air carried a faint, acrid smell. "He's gone," Joe whispered, his voice hollow. Abel stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. It looks like he left in a hurry. Perhaps he knew we were coming. Joe sank to the floor, his head in his hands. I've ruined everything. Even if he's gone, what about all the people I've hurt? I don't deserve forgiveness. Abel knelt beside him. Joe, listen to me. God's grace is greater than any sin. This is your chance to turn your life around. It's not too late. Tears streamed down Joe's face. I don't know how. I don't know where to start. I've done too much evil. Abel's voice was firm yet gentle. You start by taking one step at a time. Acknowledge your wrongs, seek forgiveness, and choose to do right. I'll help you. You're not alone. Joe looked up. His eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. You really think I can change? Abel smiled. I don't just think it, Joe. I know it. But you have to believe it too. The two men stood in the middle of the ruined hut, the silence between them profound. Abel placed a hand on Joe's shoulder. Come, let's leave this place. The real work starts now. As they walked back through the woods, Joe's steps grew steadier. By the time they reached the bridge, the first rays of dawn were breaking through the horizon. The bridge, once a symbol of deceit and despair, now seemed like a path to a new beginning. Under Abel's mentorship, Joe began to rebuild his life. He spent his days helping others, sharing his story, and warning people about the dangers of greed and dishonesty. The townspeople, initially skeptical, began to see the sincerity in his actions. One afternoon, as Joe stood on the bridge, he noticed a young boy begging on the side of the road. The boy's torn clothes and desperate eyes mirrored his own past. Joe knelt beside him and offered a hand. You don't have to live like this, Joe said softly. There's another way. Let me help you. The boy hesitated but eventually nodded. Together they walked toward the town where Abel was waiting. Joe's story became a testament to the power of truth, forgiveness, and redemption. The bridge that once symbolized deceit now stood as a reminder of hope and transformation. And for Joe, every step forward was proof that no one was beyond saving.